Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It's a joy to be with you. We have got so much going on. It's just hard to choose the stories. But you know what? We're grabbing this from the top of the headlines. And so let's talk about, Ukraine. It seems like we've been talking about Ukraine for several years now. Not, it seems we have been. Most of us don't even know where Ukraine is. And yet it's the center of our world. But what is tragic is the hundreds of thousands of people who've been killed in this conflict. And when you look at the moorings of it, it was completely avoidable. And there is a world beyond war. You just not only have to imagine it, as John Lennon said, you have to go on and decide that that's what you want. Because we can have war beyond war, a world beyond war. But what did we hear? That war is a racket? Was that Smedley Butler, who had been in war? He said, oh, no, no, no. I've come out of this and I see that the only people who benefit from these wars are the military industrial contractors. You do remember when, was it the beginning, October 7th, they said, as tragic as this is, they caught some of the military contractors talking to their board members, and they said, as sad as this is, we're about to make a lot of money, everybody. Think about that. That happened in real time, in our time. So, what about Ukraine? What has driven these European leaders to Washington D.C.? Why Ukraine? Why now? What is going on? And behind the Trump-Putin meeting, now we've got a Zelensky uh, Trump meeting. What does all of this mean? And where are we going with this? Well, I said probably the most brilliant mind I know, someone who really does want to walk us to peace and help us to reimagine our world, is David Swanson of World Beyond War. And so here we are. But before we come to you, I want you to go to Blue Sky, santitajackson.bsky.social. I'm on X. Yes, I still am there. At Santita J. At Santita J. Facebook, Santita Jackson and Friends. Please only go there. Befriend me there. And then, of course, you're meeting me on YouTube, the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. Hey, Bernadette, you're always there first. Bless your, bless your heart. Really are you beating my sister? And I'm so glad that you're here. Please, everybody, like and share, like and share. We see that we have a lot of views and shares after the show. And we need you to help us with the algorithm because it goes into the millions, quite frankly, and that's heartening. But progressive shows tend to have our algorithms toyed with in this space. And so, what I need you to do is help me help you, help me help you, and like and share the show, like and share the show, like and share the show. But let's talk about what's happening here. Crimea, what is it? And what happened that wasn't the deal cut when Berlin, uh, when the wall went down? You know, Russia said, well, okay, the USSR said, we're breaking apart. All we ask is that the NATO nations not populate our border. Please, just don't do that. We said, of course, we agree. We shook their hands, we had this agreement, and then it was thrown out the window. So now we have got um, Mr. Zelensky, President Zelensky, who is a former television actor who played a president who became a president. Wow. It just, you cannot make this stuff up. So you got to help me to understand where we are right now and why these European leaders felt compelled to come here, David Swanson. Good
Yeah.
morning.
Good morning. Yeah, I guess after help me help you is show me the money, right? And you're talking about who's making money off of this. I think the war in Ukraine has been the single biggest cause of the single biggest spending of money over the past few years, and that is the increase in military spending that we have seen and are going to continue seeing in the years to come if something doesn't change by all the NATO members, including the new additional NATO members brought on by the war in Ukraine, and including, of course, the U.S. skyrocketing military spending. And we have been saying, some of us who've seen wars before, who this isn't the first war we've ever looked at, so we sort of have a basis for knowing what's going to happen and understand what's going on when we see two sides of an endless quagmire, both declaring imminent victory day after day for years. We've been saying sooner or later they're going to have to negotiate a peace agreement and end the war, or the war is going to escalate, become a nuclear war, and end all of us. And the main argument, the argument that I had to push back against on every show, maybe, but this one because it's so good, but on almost every show and every debate and every blog post for years was, it's up to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians should get to decide. It's not up to you. You're just some schmuck who lives on the planet that will be destroyed if it goes nuclear. You don't have a say. And and they could point to polling, right? They could point to Gallup polling 3 years ago that said that most Ukrainians want the war to continue no matter what. Now, the same Gallup polling, which they've done each year 4 times, and they did it again recently, vast majority of the Ukrainians, 69% of the Ukrainians, want the war ended immediately through negotiations. Whatever people can negotiate to end the war, end the war. And, something like 22% of Ukrainians want to continue the war. And so now, when I say, let's negotiate an end to the war, as I've been saying for 3 years, nobody says, you shut up, it's up to the Ukrainians. Nobody says that. And so what do they say now? Now it's mostly, we must support the rule of law. You cannot let Russia go in and seize territory and have that become the outcome of the war, because then you won't have the rule of law in the world. I mean, this is a much more reasonable argument than the first one, and they can still make it. It just hasn't been completely eliminated like the first one. But this is, coming from supporters of a government that destroyed Afghanistan, destroyed Iraq, has, infiltrated and sabotaged and facilitated coups and militarized half the world, that is arming a live streamed genocide in Gaza, and that has attacked and sanctioned employees of international courts for doing their job. Beyond Russia, the number one violator of the rule of law, abuser of the veto power at the UN, holdout on basic legal human rights and armament treaties, is the U.S. government. Right. So it's gross hypocrisy. But also, it isn't just how a war ends that can uphold or violate law. It's the act of continuing a war. It is the greatest crime. You can't say continue the war for the sake of law, for the sake of the rule of law, when continuing a war is the highest crime there is. You have to negotiate an end to the war. And no, giving territory to Russia is not great. Giving territory to Ukraine is not great either. If people actually cared about democracy, on the table would be letting the people of those regions of Ukraine decide their own fate. And Russia would like that, of course, because the people of Crimea were always going to vote to rejoin Russia and did so, and nobody's ever proposed a revote in all these years. And the people of the eastern parts of Ukraine would too, but it's complicated because so many people have fled and so many people have been moved in and so forth, and you can claim it's illegitimate. But for those very same reasons, the government of Ukraine, which is acting, completely against the interests of its own population, does not want, excuse me, anyone to give a darn about the interests of those particular populations. And so here comes the U.S. to say to Russia and Ukraine the same thing the peace activists have been saying for 3 years. You should sit down and negotiate an end to this war. In the person of Donald Trump, who said he was going to end the thing before he moved into the White House, who said he was going to end it in 24 hours, who never yet has had the, slightest hint at an idea of how to end it, but just says this stuff. and who is, along with the US Congress, arming Ukraine. Now they're trying to get Europeans to pay for more of the weapons, but they're still providing the weapons from the United States, either at our expense as US taxpayers, or at the expense of the European governments forking over some of the money. Uh, and so it's sort of like negotiating peace between Israelis and Palestinians for decades while providing all the weapons to the Israelis, while providing the legal cover at the UN for the Israelis, while pushing the Israeli propaganda. You aren't a mediator. You aren't a fair negotiator in that sort of position. and and here comes the US media, the corporate media, the media where you can't say anything I've just said, declaring that Trump has sided with Putin. Trump is angling for a defeat and a loss. Trump is trying to give away Ukraine to the evil Russians. So before any negotiation even happens, the media is framing any possible peace agreement as a defeat and a betrayal and subservience to the Russians. And here come the European presidents and prime ministers and the unelected head of NATO and the head of the European Council to stand beside Zelensky in the White House and defend him from getting yelled at by Donald Trump, and side with the US corporate media and declare that we cannot have peace, we must have war. And presumably, given that there aren't any serious negotiators in the room at all, and this is all a PR stunt, as everything Donald Trump ever does is, and that you've got all these Europeans standing by Zelensky, we're doing this conversation, a few hours too early, but, and I hope I'm wrong. I really, really hope I'm wrong, but you wouldn't bet all your money on peace coming out of the White House today. And so,
even though he is saying that he wants peace, is that him? Is it? I mean, is it the unseen hands? Because we know that there's more than President Trump in the room. Well, I mean, it's it's Boeing, it's Northrop Grumman, right? I mean, you have a lot of interest in keeping this war going, or am I misreading this?
And these are companies that have paid for the elections of not just this president, but some of the people in the US Congress, and who have previously employed and will likely in the future employ some of these bureaucrats who are in the room, and who are behind NATO, whose existence, whose survival, whose expansion depends on the weapons business. Uh, and you have this talk of, well, if you're going to declare that Ukraine will never be in NATO, which, you could have declared that 3 years ago and avoided this whole thing, you're going to have to give US security guarantees. Well, what does that mean? That means if Ukraine is in a war, the US has to join the war, not just with free weapons, but with US troops, and not just with CIA and special forces, as in this case, but openly with big numbers of US troops. And needless to say, I mean, we're in a stellar example of the problem. Ukraine was waging war in the eastern part of Ukraine for years before the so-called start of the war, with the big Russian escalation of the war invading Ukraine. So who's to say who the judge gets to be over who started it? And all Ukraine would have to do with a U.S. promise to join in a war would be to start a war and declare that Russia had started it. And so these security guarantees are actually a guarantee of insecurity, and pursuing peace and democracy and the interests of the people of the various regions of Ukraine would be a way to have security guarantees of some measure. But that's not what they mean when they say that stuff.
Well, what is NATO, and what prestige can be attached to membership to NATO, particularly on behalf of, particularly with Ukraine?
Well, one would hope no prestige. One would hope shame and deep regret and humiliation. But NATO is of course an organization that has no legal standing, and when it wages wars, they aren't any less a crime than anyone else's. But which has dozens of members and many dozens of partners. And has this commitment that everyone focuses on in Article 5 of the treaty that creates NATO, that if one of its members is attacked and is in a war, the other ones have to all join in and support. Now, NATO has waged numerous wars since the so-called end of the Cold War in an effort to justify its continued existence, but it's never once waged a war of defense because one of its members was attacked. The only time it ever even tried to pretend it was, demanding that all of its members join in a war was in the U.S. war on Afghanistan, thousands of miles from the United States. But it has, of course, waged wars in the former Yugoslavia and in Afghanistan and in large measure in Iraq and in Libya, and has been a big supporter of numerous wars, including the war on Gaza. And it's far and away the biggest wheeler and dealer maker of weapons deals, selling weapons from one NATO member to another, selling tried and tested Israeli weapons to other NATO members. Israel's not a NATO member, but it's a close partner with an office in NATO headquarters. And
So
and
can we really say they're not a NATO member? I mean, really, practically speaking.
I mean, in a sense, all the NATO partners and allies are practically the same as the members. They
Mhm.
work closely with NATO. They do weapons deals with NATO. They the key difference in being a member rather than being a partner for peace of all things, and the reason that Ukraine has not been made a member is that all the other members are committing to jump into any war that a member is in. Whereas if you're a NATO partner and they've got them through, Asia and Africa and Latin America, uh, the members are not promising to join in your wars. And you'd think that was a good thing. Who wants to escalate wars around the world?
Well, who
But
does? Who wants to? I
well,
mean,
Lockheed Martin, as you said.
I'm not laughing at this because it's not funny, but I mean, you're asking questions that they seem rhetorical, but quite frankly, when you talk to people, and I have friends who are part of the military industrial complex, and Putin is a thug who's the devil. Zelensky is about the same, but we must fight, 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 fight. We've got to help Ukraine. And when I ask them why, oh my, it's blasphemous. And I say, wait a minute, help me to understand, because the provocateur here, really, we broke a deal, okay? And people are dying all the time. And no, that falls on deaf ears, David Swanson.
But the hundreds and thousands of people who have been killed, been injured, been traumatized, been made homeless, had to flee their homes and their countries in Ukraine and in Russia, not a single one of them has been Putin or Zelensky. They have been ordinary people. Wars are not fought against a single demonized individual, no matter how legitimate the demonization. They're fought against people and towns and villages and cities and countryside. And so it's not so much a question of exactly how good or bad or horrendous a politician Vladimir Putin is. It's a question of the absolute stupidity of falling for the war propaganda that pretends that a war is fought against a single hated individual. It's just idiocy. A war is fought against the people who live where that war is happening. And So I have little sympathy for fans of Vladimir Putin. I think he's as bad as most politicians, and I have absolutely no sympathy for supporters of Mr. Zelensky, who is blatantly violating the will of the Ukrainian public, who has done away with elections and parties and free speech and assembly and basic human rights in Ukraine, where my friends who live in Ukraine who support peace can go to prison for it, just like others can in Russia. These are not, angels or devils. These are politicians, like Donald Trump. Uh, and the question is, are we going to stop masses of people taking organized action to kill each other at risk of nuclear apocalypse if this escalates? This is a U.S. Russia conflict. These are the two places with most of the nuclear weapons in the world. Or are we going to stop it? You can't have peace unless you have justice. Well, you also can't have justice unless you have peace. You can't work on making Ukraine a better place until the bombs stop falling. And the Ukraine war over the past few years has dramatically distorted the whole world's priorities. We aren't working to demilitarize. We aren't working on that peace dividend we were supposed to get at the so-called end of the Cold War. We aren't working on addressing disease epidemics or poverty or homelessness. We aren't taking on the real risks of ecological collapse and nuclear collapse. We're escalating military spending. We're sending this unelected head of NATO to demand of each European president and prime minister that they take money out of healthcare, money out of education, money out of retirement, and put it into weapons. And then they're not only obeying him, they're getting on a plane with him and flying to the White House to defend, this comic actor, this Ronald Reagan of Ukraine, uh, in the White House, so that Donald Trump, of all people, doesn't risk imposing peace on the world.
It's the battle of the network stars. I just think I'm going back like 30 years on network TV. But
Yeah.
but real lives are here. I mean, that's why I was asking you about NATO. I mean, who are they? When you go to Brussels, they have this huge office and they are there. And it's like they are I guess, aside from Washington, they're the military center for the West. And I'm just trying to find out what is the axe that the West has to grind with Russia? What? Because I just need to I just need to understand why we do what we do.
Well, it's worth understanding that NATO is an arm of the US government almost entirely. It doesn't make democratic decisions among its members. It doesn't find out what the UK and France and Germany and Canada and so forth want and come up with a consensus or a democratic majority. It does what the US wants almost always, unless it can't ever quite get all the other NATO members to come along, and then it does nothing. And it does this whether the president is a Democrat or a Republican, whether it is Biden or Trump. The notion that Trump is the enemy of NATO when Trump has done vastly more to support NATO than Biden did, when even Trump 1.0 got NATO members to increase their military spending more than Biden did with this war to, to help him. Never mind now, when Trump has pulled out this absolutely absurd notion of spending 5% of your economy on wars. And the European governments have said, yes, sir, and saluted this fascist buffoon. So that's what NATO is. Why would NATO or the United States have a problem with Russia? Um, They have a problem with not selling weapons. They have a problem with weapons sales plummeting. They love weapons sales escalating, even when weapons are going to both sides of a future conflict. And terrorism doesn't do it. So Osama bin Laden doesn't do it. It has to be Russia or China, and Russia has worked very, very well. And we've all got a century of anti-Russian media in us, and decades of Russiagate in us, and weeks and months of, you know, Trump hates NATO, so you must love NATO, and this incredible propaganda job of showing us the suffering of Ukrainians in a war. I would love for the US media to show us the suffering of everybody on every side of every war. But they picked this one. They picked this one side of this one war. Imagine if they treated Palestinians like they do Ukrainians. But to show us the Ukrainians suffering in a war and then declare that it's the evil of Russia, and Russia is subhuman monsters and you can't talk to them, and there never was any war before the Russian invasion, and there never was any coup before the Russian invasion, and there never was any attempt to pervert the Ukrainian government and push this empire over that one before the Russian invasion, which is sort of the start of history, as October 7th is in Palestine. This creates this animosity toward Russia. It's not, it has nothing to do with Russian culture or even past Russian actions. It has to do with the need to have an enemy. Russia wanted to join NATO. Russia tried several times over the past decades to join NATO, but NATO would have lost its reason to exist. So NATO pretended.
Back up. Russia wanted to join NATO. I think that people forget that.
Well, people are never told that in U.S. media. They don't even have to forget it. But Russia, way back when, after World War II, into the 50s, wanted to join. Russia back in the 90s wanted to join. And what they did was they made Russia a so-called partner for peace of NATO, and did the same thing for a bunch of other former Soviet republics that had been part of Russia's Soviet empire, made them partners for peace. But behind closed doors, whisper, whisper, the plan was then to turn all those partners for peace into full-blown NATO members, except Russia, which would just stay a partner for peace. And then when something bad happened, like the war in Ukraine, you'd scratch off that partner for peace bit as well and keep Russia as the enemy.
What are we doing there? How, because we have Americans who are on the ground there. They are mercenaries, yes, but we do have Americans on the ground there. I like you think that war is just, it always ends up with a peace deal. So when you look at all of the people who have been killed in war, your heart just breaks because you say, what was this about, really? So, yeah. I mean, help me to understand why we're here, and what is going to happen today. Is this just merely performative? With these European leaders they've come in to do what? To talk with President Zelensky about what? What's going to happen here?
Well, I'm much better on the first part of this, the past, than the future. I'm not good at predicting the future, but I mean, again, if I have to bet, not much is going to come out of this, and that's worse than saying just nothing. Just it's going to stay the same, because if they make this big show of trying to make peace and fail, even if they fail very, very intentionally, they're going to then be able to say, we tried peace. We made every effort for peace. This is now a war of last resort, and escalate the war. And by they, I mean both sides, the Russian side and the European side / US side. And again, this is a conflict between nuclear powers. This is the riskiest thing. We are, in the view of many experts, closer than in the Cuban Missile Crisis or any other time to swiftly. I'm not talking about ecological collapse over decades or centuries. I'm talking about very, very swiftly ending all life on this little planet. And And so this is high stakes, even if it looks like, a remake of Democracy happening there at the White House. It's really, really high stakes. And we say that the U.S. isn't there, but of course, U.S. troops are there in very small numbers, so-called special forces, CIA, etc. And they're running the whole thing out of an office at a U.S. base in Germany. They're making the plans. They're using the satellites. They're using the U.S. technology. They're targeting the strikes, etc. It's very much a U.S. war with mostly other people's bodies going into the ground. How did we get here? Well, the Cold War ended, supposedly. The nuclear weapons were scaled back, but both sides still had plenty to destroy the planet many times over. And NATO promised not to expand. The U.S. promised not to expand, and lied. And NATO was expanded over the decades, most significantly when a guy named Bill Clinton was in the White House, and expanded in large part to benefit the weapons dealers, which funded and ran a committee to lobby Congress for NATO expansion. And Russia grew more and more anxious and angry and insistent, and many didn't care, many didn't believe it, many didn't pay attention, but many US experts warned over and over again, you keep on this path, you're going to get war with Russia. Some predicted you keep on this path, you're going to get war with Russia, and advocated for it. You have a report out of the Rand Corporation, an arm of the US military, essentially, and on the beach there in California, saying, here's how we can get a war with Russia. And they followed the recipe. And then you have the U.S., interfering with Ukrainian elections, the Russians and the U.S. pushing each other's candidates in Ukraine, the U.S. supporting a coup in Ukraine, with a coalition of really right-wing Nazi types, and eventually Zelensky coming in as, this know-nothing comedic actor president, dependent in part on the right-wingers in his coalition, and on the continuation of the war, just like Netanyahu, just like Putin. The wars keep these guys in office, and then you have, the people of Crimea vote yes with Russian troops there that never should have been in the streets, but the vote was, everybody knew which way the vote would go, no matter who held the vote. And then you have the violence in eastern Ukraine, and much more of it by the Ukrainian government than by those who want to leave Ukraine. But you have this for years, and Russia proposing over and over again deals. Let's make this deal and have peace. That were in large part the Minsk agreements that were already in place that the Europeans meant to violate and violated, that were better than any deal anybody's going to get now. And the U.S. just scornfully, contemptuously brushing them aside as if Russia had said nothing. And then you have a Russian invasion, which, is inexcusable. It's criminal. But everybody saw it coming, and apparently didn't care or wanted it. And then you have this huge boost in support for NATO and Western militarism, which surely the Russian government saw coming and didn't care, thought waging a war would be worth that.
But they saw it coming. The West saw it coming, but they did nothing to prevent it. In fact, they stepped back and egged it on. And again, you look at, I don't know why we want to pick a fight with Russia, who share borders and, what did they say, unbreakable ties with China. That just doesn't make sense to me. Because these are not, these are all relationships that have many layers to them, David Swanson. I mean, when I see Russia, I see China. Many Russians are ethnically Chinese. A big, 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 big swath of them are. Um, Russia bleeds into China. And I keep bringing China up because they are the number one economy in the world, David. I mean, America is not the top dog anymore. We're not. And many of us are not even physically fit enough to join the military. What we're doing with the military, we're deploying them on the streets of the United States to quell future unrest. That was leaked in a Pentagon paper that was leaked, that was reported in the Washington Post last week. I'm just trying to. You got to help me to understand where this is going, because with all of this, it's not just Putin, but it's like you said, it's not just one person. It's a people who have feelings, who feel violated. I mean, they do, and like you said, you keep bringing up something that we don't talk about. A potential nuclear it's not, you don't have a nuclear conflict, you have nuclear annihilation. No
Yes.
one survives a nuclear blast ultimately, or do I have that wrong?
Well, the war planners and the weapons manufacturers like to talk about using one or more nuclear bombs and the world continuing as before. You even have pundits suggesting using one nuclear bomb to demonstrate to people what it can do, as if Hiroshima and Nagasaki never happened. You have this, absurd distinction between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons, where the tactical ones are the smaller ones, even if they're vastly bigger than what destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that are supposedly usable, like usable as part of a war, and then the war continues or ends, but life goes on. Most commentators and experts and scholars don't think there's any such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon or a limited nuclear war, and don't see, and the war makers themselves, their war game scenarios and so forth, bear this out, that once a nuclear weapon is used, other nuclear weapons will be used and it will escalate. And a considerable number of nuclear weapons being used is likely. We haven't run the experiment yet, thank goodness. I hope it's all wrong, but scientists believe it's likely to create a nuclear winter, to fill the atmosphere with dust and debris and block out the sun, and all the crops die, and there's nothing to eat, and the living envy the dead, because if you didn't die from the radiation, you're going to die from the starvation and the violence that accompanies it. So it's not something you play around with. It's a danger as great as ecological collapse, which we actually are much more open about talking about, even if we're not really doing anything to address it. It's just on a faster scale. And I went to Russia some years back, and I met with lots of people in Moscow, and people can assume they're all sociopathic liars, but they pretty much all said, whenever it came up, as many in Russia have said for years, that they always saw themselves as Europeans. They always wanted to be Europeans. They never liked China. They never liked the Chinese. They never wanted an alliance with China. But it's the endless refusal of the United States and NATO and the European Union. It's kicking them out over and over again, that has led to them talking with China. Um,
Wait a minute. Why don't they want Russians to be European? What is that? I mean, is it because some of them are people of color? I mean, help me to. I'm just trying to. I've always tried to figure that out. Why is there such pushback against Russians being considered European?
Well, I don't want to minimize racism in Europe. There's tons of it, but I don't think that's the main problem here. I think the main problem is that NATO needs an enemy, and European governments with corrupt politicians funded by weapons dealers and supported by the same corrupt interests as U.S. Congress members need to have an enemy, and come to believe, war thinking themselves, come to believe that it's an implacable, you know, inscrutable, irrational, subhuman enemy that one could never make peace with. And if you want peace, prepare for war, and so forth. And they act accordingly. And so there are plenty of ordinary people in Europe who have nothing against people in Russia, and vice versa. And I don't think if the government's made peace, you would need any massive educational campaigns for the people. I think the people would be fine having more cultural and commercial interactions. I think it's the governments, and I think. I think when it comes to China, there's more racism, and I think when it comes to Africa and the Middle East, there's more racism, and there may be racism toward Russia. But Russia is the biggest country in the world, and it goes from Europe to Asia, and but Moscow is in the little European corner of it, and they like to think of themselves as European. In fact, the racists, the real hardcore racists in Europe and in the United States, think of the Russians and the Russian government and the Russian military as being on their side. And they support Russia in the war in Ukraine. And they came here to my town of Charlottesville and chanted not only "Jews will not replace us," but chanted stuff in support of Russia. So
But that's the right wing of Russia. But because then Russia will side with the Palestinians. Then Russia will side with the ANC and the South Africans when they are pushing back against apartheid. Paul Robeson and other and Du Bois go to Russia for cover when our own government closes in on them and their left wing politics. So there's that part of Russia too. You've got the extreme right, you've got the extreme left, right?
Yeah, but I don't think Du Bois or Robeson would go to Russia now, at least not in support of the Russian government. And the Russian government would only support them if it was as enemies and refugees from the U.S. government, the same as it does, whistleblowers who blow the whistle on the NSA and end up in Russia.
But that's kind of what Robeson, he was treated as. He was treated as an enemy of state. That's why he had to leave the United States. We shut him down. Du Bois died living in Ghana, because, these are two crown jewels of America who were rejected by America. I'm merely making the point that, it's a mixed bag. And I think you're right. I absolutely agree that NATO, the West needs an enemy. I just think that when you look at the problems that NATO countries are having, feeding their people, we've taken $1 trillion out of our healthcare system, David Swanson. The Yale University study says it's going to result in more than 50,000 excess deaths a year, at least. We can't afford this. You have people, you're seeing store shelves that have less and less food. Food. My mother's telling me, go get sugar. Make sure you're stocked up with some canned beans and some dried beans, but make sure you have canned beans in case you can't cook. My mother's 81. She's seen some things before.
Yeah.
Beyond coming out of the civil rights movement, she has seen some things like my great grandmother and grandmothers before her kept believing always keeping cash because they had seen the Great Depression. And they said, no, I saw this happen. And if I saw it happen once, I knew it could happen again. And we didn't see the Cold War. but I feel like this is where we are again, and I'm trying to find out, David, where is this all heading? Because the nuclear winter is these people play with nuclear war, and they play with war as if it can't happen here. I mean, it's like we're looking at a civil war in the United States, David. I mean, this
Yeah.
feels like.
Well, I'm old enough to have seen part of the Cold War, but I see troops going into Los Angeles and Washington D.C., and these are military troops obeying illegal orders. And you have, prestigious, elite, mainstream cultural institutions like the New York Times saying absurdly, we thought the military would refuse such illegal orders. When did the US military ever refuse illegal orders? I mean, individuals, rank and file, have to their enormous credit and are right now refusing illegal orders. But the top brass of the US military, to count on it to simply refuse illegal orders rather than imposing legal standards with a popular movement forcing our will on the government. This is just dreamland, and I think we're going to see this potentially in Chicago. Trump has been threatening. We're going to see this in other cities, and we're going to need massive strategic, nonviolent refusal to cooperate, resistance, and not, I think, throwing sandwiches at soldiers, which doesn't help. Not, I think, shouting, go home, you fascists, but I think saying, put down your guns, my brothers and sisters, because you are Americans, and we are Americans, and we are people of this place, and you should not be obeying the illegal orders of this corporate felon occupying the White House. You should be standing shoulder to shoulder with us against the guns. We can look to so many examples, even in recent months and years from around the world, including in Korea, where they tried to impose martial law and the people said no with massive nonviolent turnout. We're going to have to figure out how to do this. It's going to take courage. It's going to take risk. But people seem to love that. It's in every ad for the military is, go be brave and take risks and make sacrifices for, and they leave out, for the corporate profits of Lockheed Martin. Well, you can be brave and heroic and take risks for the people of your city uh, by standing up against these masked, unidentified thugs, against these armed, identified troops. But this is really the war's coming home to roost here. This if people who say that foreign policy has nothing to do with me are gonna be snapping out of that pretty soon, I think.
Well, when you see well what is happening in America, I mean, I've heard so often Dr. King said it, and I've heard Colleen Rowley, the FBI whistleblower. I've heard other people say the bombs we drop overseas will explode at home. I mean, is that what drives your drive for peace? Because I think that more than um, I absolutely support world beyond war, but I think you're also helping us to not imagine, but to work toward a world filled with peace.
Yeah.
What shift in our thinking and let alone and policies can get us there?
Well, I think to find something encouraging, I think, huge majority in the US now is sick and tired of the mass slaughter of men, women, and children in Palestine and their starvation and their deprivation and their organized genocide. And I think that's very, very encouraging. And it's not because They want the dollars spent bombing those people spent on their schools, which of course would be a good thing. It would be good to spend those dollars on schools both here and there and everywhere else. There's more than enough money if you take the money out of the bombs, which cost vastly more than books. Uh, but simply because they're not evil sociopathic people, and they don't want to see men, women, and children being slaughtered in Palestine. And I think to the extent that people come to see that this is what a war is, that the war in Ukraine, that the war in Sudan, that all the wars around the world are essentially like the war in Gaza. They're not identical, but they're all absolutely unjustifiable horrors that wouldn't exist without providing the weapons and the legal cover and the propaganda that our government leads the world in. And then if people are willing to look a little harder at it's ugly, but look at the fact that the US government is really organizing for a war with China that could, go
How,
beyond what we're fearing with a war with Russia, right? So,
what would that look like?
well, it would probably look like the aforementioned nuclear winter, right? I mean, it would look like the end of everything. It's hard to know how it could look like anything else. But the United States has close to 900 military bases surrounding on three sides from west to east, Russia and Iran and China, and is building more rapidly, and is building lots of them up in Scandinavia, which is now on board with NATO. And you you can't get away in Washington, D.C. There's not a single person, no matter how progressive, who doesn't talk in terms of competition with China.
Yeah.
And for some, the competition is who launches the nukes first. And in others, it's who makes more, computer chips. But it's always on that same theme of competition between the United States and China. It's not my competition. It's not your competition. It's not a competition that impacts my life in Charlottesville, Virginia. It's a competition of militaries and governments that doesn't benefit. It doesn't benefit any more than this endless Cold War has benefited the people of the U.S. or Soviet Union / Russia. It doesn't benefit the people of China or the people of the United States. It's used to justify all kinds of horrors. We can't let you say that on your show because China, and it's nonsensical and it's dangerous.
What would you like for us to know, just as we wrap things up? Because we will be looking at the news, and doubtless the spin will be that Trump drew the short straw with Putin. Uh, he's hostile to Zelensky, so he needs European cover. What should be our takeaway?
Well,
I didn't
I
mean to elicit that response.
I mean there's not a quick here's why you should be happy and gleeful response, right? But I think no matter how despicable Donald Trump is, or Vladimir Putin or Zelensky are, I mean, I have zero respect for any of these people. Uh, we need a peace agreement and we need a ceasefire. And if a ceasefire is just going to be a pause to reload, we need a peace agreement. And the fact that Donald Trump said we need a peace agreement doesn't mean we don't need a peace agreement. If if Donald Trump said he loved your mother, that's not a reason to start hating your mother, right? Run your own life, and so we need a peace agreement. And if the corporate media says we don't need a peace agreement, well, they're the same people who said we needed all these wars in the first place. They're the same people who put Donald Trump on because it was good for ratings. Don't listen to them. Uh, but we're going to need a huge outpouring of public support for ending these wars. Every weapons shipment sent to Israel or Ukraine violates numerous U.S. laws already. And activist groups like the ones I work with are busy trying to pass one more law, to make it even more illegal to be sending these weapons. Uh, but we're not going to get these laws acted upon unless the people turn out, get in the streets while your Congress critters are still home during the month of August. Go and confront them in person, go to their offices, ask for meetings, go to their public events, go to the media, go to their homes. I don't care. Non-violently, not cruelly, but passionately confront these people with the evil they are engaged in or standing by and allowing to happen. They should not have a moment's rest. There should be pots and pans outside every window 24/7 until the weapons shipments stop and the peace negotiations are supported by everybody. I mean, this is a survival question. This is not, there are lots of other hugely important issues we got to work on too, but this is a question of human survival.
David Swanson, World Beyond War, everyone. We can make that happen. We're but a thought away from making that happen. We have to decide that we want peace. Everybody, let's continue to talk and sending you much love and many blessings down there in peaceful Charlottesville in what is it, in horse country, where my brother went to school at UVA. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. And I just wish you peace. I wish you love. Everybody, but we've got a couple more hours of the Santita Jackson show. Stay tuned. We're looking at this summit as we watch President Zelensky arrive at the White House for this historic meeting. We'll be continuing to look at that. We're going to also look at these young people, the youth of Washington, D.C., particularly those who are Black and brown, are saying that they are disturbed. Yes, they're even frightened by the military on the ground. What will this mean? People are walking up to folk, David Swanson, in neighborhoods, in affluent neighborhoods, and they're asking white couples, what are you doing here? Now, if that's happening to them, what could be happening to people who are far more vulnerable, people who read as being suspect? Boy, oh boy, oh boy, we have to decide where we go from here. Chaos or community? Dr. King posed that question about 60 years ago. It is as relevant today as it was then. Back with more of the Santita Jackson Show in just a few minutes.